Good afternoon and welcome everyone to Book Talk, Kiss the Red Stairs with Marsha Lederman. I'm Jennifer Hicks and I'm the Director of Alumni and Stakeholder Programs at our university. And we're really excited to gather here today to hear more about this fantastic memoir. Before we begin, I want to pay my respect to the Indigenous peoples, elders and ancestors who stewarded and nurtured for the land and people that lived where the university is located today. At the university, we have made a real commitment, an important commitment to reconciliation. And I invite you to learn a little bit more about that by visiting online or in person the next time we're able to gather at the campus. A couple of quick reminders. This book talk today is being recorded, so you can rewatch it at any time and share it with your friends and family. And two, if you have questions for today's speakers during the session, please forward them through the Q&A located at the bottom of the Zoom. Now I'm delighted to introduce you to the author of Kiss the Red Stairs, The Holocaust Once Removed, Marsha Lederman, and the moderator for today's event, Professor Ruth Panofsky. Marsha Lederman is the Western Arts correspondent for the Globe and Mail. Before joining the Globe, Marsha worked for CBC Radio, and she's also worked in commercial radio as a reporter, anchor, and talk show host. More importantly, she is an alum of our university, graduating from the Radio and Television Arts program, and she's also worked as a TA in the School of Journalism. Her first book, Kiss the Red Stairs, The Holocaust Once Removed, will be released next week on May 3rd, and we'll drop a link in the chat so you can pre-order your copy. Welcome back to Book Talk, Marsha.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. It's so great to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Thrilled. Ruth Panofsky is a poet, writer, editor, and professor in the Department of English at our university. She teaches Holocaust literature and Canadian Jewish literature. Her publications include the award-winning 2-volume Collected Poems of Miriam Waddington, a critical edition, At Odds in the World, Essays on Jewish Canadian Women Writers, and The Force of Vocation, the literary career of Adele Wiseman. Welcome, Ruth.
Thank you, Jennifer. So glad to be here, and I'm so happy to have this opportunity to talk to Marsha.
Thank you.
Hi, Ruth. Hi, Ruth.
Marsha.
So great to see you.
Well, without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to the two of you and take a step back and look forward to enjoying this conversation.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jennifer.
So before we start, I wanted to give our audience a little taste of what to expect in your book, Marsha. So just a little bit of background on your memoir. So when you were 5, you asked your mother a simple question that led to a horrifying answer, as you record in your memoir. Sitting in your kitchen, you asked your mother why you didn't have any grandparents, and she told you the truth, which was the Holocaust. Decades later, your parents have died, and you are yourself a mother to a young son, and you begin to wonder how much of that history has shaped your own life. And reeling in the wake of a divorce, you crave your parents' help, but they are no longer around. And so you're gripped by the need to understand this trauma that they suffered. And you begin on your own journey into the past to tell your family's stories of loss and resilience. So Kiss the Red Stairs is a compelling memoir of Holocaust survival, intergenerational trauma, divorce, and discovery. And it really is an incredible story, Marsha.
Thank you. That means a lot.
So now I wanted to, I just have several questions, and then we're going to have time for the audience to pose some questions at the end of our discussion. And please submit them in the Zoom Q&A function. So first of all, what inspired you to write this memoir, Marsha?
Well, it started really as sort of a research project for myself. I wanted to know more about what had happened to my parents during the Holocaust and what had happened to their families. And also, I was really interested in some science that was coming out. This was around 2015. And it was looking into intergenerational trauma, specifically in children of Holocaust survivors, and whether that trauma could be passed on not just through nurture, through things happening in the home, but biologically, like at the cellular level. And reading these studies, I started wondering if that had happened to me and if it was in some way responsible for some of my own issues. I'm extremely pessimistic. I can be pretty anxious. And at the time, I was struggling with some personal things, and I I guess I just started writing things down, and I found that enormously satisfying to be able to just sort of work on something like that that was so central to my life and who I am. So I just kept going, and I realized, I guess, at some point with the encouragement of very close people that maybe it could be a book.
Yeah. I remember when all that epigenetic stuff that you talk about in the book came out in the press. It was fascinating, and it really gripped my mind because I teach Holocaust literature, and so it's something that was really an important discovery. And I found your treatment of it, the way you integrate it in your memoir, really, really interesting.
Thank you. It took me a long time. Science was not my
Yeah.
strong point. And I'm sure I'm not the only RTA grad, radio and television arts grad, that could say that. Sorry.
So tell me a little bit of what was some of the more interesting things you learned about your family as you wrote the memoir?
Well, I mean, I sort of knew the basic structure of what had happened to my parents. Um, but something that I I didn't know or I hadn't read in a long time was my father had kept a diary in 1979. He went back to Poland. He was from a city called Lodz, and he kept a diary during that trip, and I reread it when I was writing all of this down. And he wrote about um, going back to not just Lodz, but to a place called Pietrków Trybunalski, which is where his family had been either moved or been sent to the ghetto there, and that's where they were early in the war. And my father was a laborer in that ghetto, a forced laborer, and from there he ended up escaping. He got papers from a Polish official that identified him as a Catholic Pole. He escaped into Germany on a train. Like, I can't even imagine the courage that took for a Jewish man, young Jewish man, to do that. And in Germany, he became a laborer on a farm, which is where he lived for the rest of the war under this false name and false identity. So I knew all of that, but there were all kinds of things that I didn't know, and I learned from that diary that my sister dug up. Um, so he died right after I turned 18, like a few days later, and it was unexpected. He was on a trip. I never got to say goodbye to him. And as a teenager, I guess I wasn't that interested in his life, which I have eternal regrets about, but I didn't ask him a lot of questions. That diary was such a window into not just his story, but kind of like who he was. He was really funny and observant and complex, and really, he was a beautiful writer, and I felt very close to him reading that diary, and I felt like maybe I had inherited some of these traits. But there was one thing in particular that I hadn't known until I read that diary, and that was that his younger brother Isaac, who was murdered, before he was murdered, he had to dig a mass grave in Pietrków Trybunalski, and all these townspeople that he knew were murdered there. He wasn't. He ended up being murdered at Treblinka. But that was something I hadn't known, and I have been really driven since then to go there. I have been to Poland, but I haven't been there, and I want to go to Pietrków Trybunalski, and I really want to find the site of that mass grave, and I want to say Kaddish, which is the Jewish mourner's prayer for all those people who died there.
Yeah. I have to say, the way you integrated your father's journal, because your memoir draws on his actual words, it's just so moving. and so compelling, and really brings his story to life, and in a way that complements your own kind of probing. I really appreciated that, Marsha.
Thank you, Ruth. Wasn't he a beautiful writer?
He was a fabulous writer. Oh, it was really, really terrific the way you brought that in.
Thank you. Okay, I'm not gonna cry. I'm
Okay.
not going to cry.
Well, it's a sad story. There's so much sadness there, but there's so much else too. So can you go on to describe a bit about the process of writing your memoir? Was it, well, obviously it was difficult. It has to be difficult. Was it angering, healing? And then the other side of it is, how did you ensure your own well-being while you were, confronting these atrocities that were so personal?
Yeah, and I was writing most of it during a pandemic while going through a divorce. I do not recommend any of that. It
Yeah.
was really, really difficult often. I think the hardest part of it was the research because I was trying to piece, I mean, the hardest part on me emotionally. Um, I was trying to piece together what had happened or what might have happened to my family because there's no one left to ask. So without that, I went back to books that had been written by people that my parents knew or were in a similar circumstance as my parents, might have been in the same place. Um, and the horrors that I was confronted with were just astonishing. I watched Shoah, the documentary, which I'm sure you've seen, right, Ruth?
I've seen
Um,
parts of it, yeah.
yeah, so it's over 9 hours, and I set aside a weekend to watch this, and it was something I hadn't realized is that it specifically looks at the death process. Um, and it was really it was hard to take. So yeah, so I was exposing myself to all of these horrors, and that was very, very difficult. But I will also say that I was also reading some really beautiful things, like Edith Egger is an Auschwitz survivor who wrote a book called The Choice, and that really helped me. It gave me a lot of perspective. It gave me hope. Same with Eva Hoffman's book. Or I read a few of her books, and I that was very helpful to me too, to think that there's healing. Healing is possible. And I have to say, what made it even more difficult was I couldn't be around people. It was a pandemic. I was locked up at home with my son, who gave me a lot of joy and respite through this whole thing. That was a huge part of it, just being able to turn off what I was doing with the book and focus on him. He is hilarious and he made me laugh a lot. And the other thing I did was I would spend time in nature. Vancouver is beautiful, and I would go to the ocean or walk in the forest, and it was always by myself generally, but it really did help me. It was sort of a beautiful antidote to what I was learning about what people did a few decades ago.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things that I love about your book is the voice that you use. It's a very striking voice. I've read lots of memoirs. None of them reach out from the page in the way that you do. And I wondered if you could describe, at the quality of voice that you chose to use. It's very, to my mind, direct, honest, a deliberate attempt to connect with the reader. I don't know if you'd agree with that, but that's how it struck me.
Oh,
And
that makes me so happy to hear that because that is exactly what I wanted to do. Like that voice is my voice. You're talking to me now. You probably can hear that I might sound a bit similar to how the book reads.
yeah,
I think of that book as like a reflection of me. Like it's neurotic and anxious, but curious and funny. Like, and I know that's weird, right? And I've tried to explain this to a few people. Like the book is actually kind of funny at times, and it's not that I'm making light or making fun of the Holocaust whatsoever. Of course, I'm not doing that, but I am able to laugh, I think, at my own weirdness. And a trick that I use because as you know, I write for a newspaper, so I write a lot. And sometimes it's there's a bit of a block. I'm having a hard time writing, getting down on the paper what I need to say. And my trick that I use always is pretend I'm telling something to somebody. And that's how I wrote the book. I'm telling this story to somebody, you, the reader. And I guess I break that fourth wall a lot because I felt like I wanted to be talking to people. You know, when my agent first read it, she said to me, your book is really good company. And that made me so happy because that's really what I wanted it to be. Yes, there are horrors in it for sure. There's some terrible stuff, but I want it to be me telling you a story, me, a friend to you.
Well, you draw us along in your story too. Like it even, there's a lot of stuff we learn, but we're learning alongside you. And it's a very warm kind of way to write this narrative, I felt.
Thank you. I appreciate that because you know what? It's gutting stuff for
Yeah.
sure. I know it's really hard to read this stuff. And it's not like I employed any sort of like tactic, like every 5 pages, put some comic relief. It's not like that. I wanted it to be like I'm sitting down with someone and telling a horrible story, but we're still two people in this beautiful world. And let's let's appreciate that beauty. And part of the beauty of life is humor.
Yeah, the humor is also a striking feature. And I think it's really important. And it does, there you need to help the reader through, and the humor does that because there's a lot of darkness in the narrative. Um, so, what do you hope readers will take away from the book, Marsha?
Oh, a lot. Well, first of all, I would say like I'm going to appeal to anyone who's watching this right now. If you have parents or grandparents or any older family, ask the questions and write down the answers and like record them with your phone. Like I don't care how you do it. I didn't do that, and I have such strong regrets. The years that I have spent trying to figure out what happened to my parents, I could have figured out during one conversation, sitting down with my mother. So I would say that's a big takeaway. Please talk to your family. Another big takeaway is, we say a lot in this community, never again, that we say as Jews. We're talking about the Holocaust, but never again should there be a genocide. Never again should there be atrocities. And guess what? It's happening all around us. It's happening again. It's happening right now in Ukraine and many other places, and it's about to happen in huge numbers with the climate emergency. So, I want to say that if something like that is happening, and it is, that we all have a responsibility. I feel like I have a special responsibility because of what my parents lived through, but we all have a responsibility to speak up and do something. I don't always know what that means or how to do it, and it's so easy to feel impotent. Like I feel like, what power do I really have? But I just want to encourage people to do what they can. Um, can I can I give another takeaway?
Yes,
Do I have
yes,
time? Okay.
yes.
I just want to say that if there is trauma in your past, and so many of us have trauma in our past, it that we have maybe inherited through biology or through environment. We've also inherited resilience, and that was something that really came through to me. And my parents survived the Holocaust in part through resilience, mostly through luck and circumstance. Um, but what's amazing to me is that after that, they built their lives up again. They had kids. They moved to a country where they couldn't speak the language. They bought a bought a house. They started a business. They did all of that despite the absolute horrors they had lived through. And I like to think that along with any trauma they experience that I inherited, I also experience that resilience. So that's, I hope people get that message. And also that even when things are terrible, not always, but often when things are terrible, there's a way to get through it. You know, healing is possible. I was going through a very hard time when I was writing that book, and today I'm great. Well, I'm okay. Great might be taking it a bit too far.
I think we have time for one more question, and I wanted to know whether, the time that you spent at the university, do you think you're carrying it into your life now, and how does it have a particular effect on this book?
Oh, yes. Oh, I'm so glad to be able to talk about that because there was a specific course I took. So I'm a radio and television arts grad, 1988. It was only a 3-year course then, and we got a Bachelor of Applied Arts, a BA, we used to say. And there was a course that I took in first year, I think it was called Media and Sociology, and we had this amazing professor, John Sakaris, and he was instrumental for me in opening my eyes to the power of media, like for good and bad, and how we could use platforms to, I don't know, change the world, but influence the world. So that was very important to me as a student at the school. But more than anything, I would say it was the social aspect. And I hate to, I know you're a professor, or maybe you don't want to hear this, but the people I was with in my program, they were all these like amazing, smart, and talented and quirky like stars. They were just so interesting, and we had so much fun, and I learned so much from them. And they were so different from a lot of the people I grew up with. And like to this day, some of my best friends are from RTA, from my time at Ryerson, and they helped make me who I am.
That's terrific. That's just great. Well, I'm really happy to hear that.
Yeah, it was a great experience. I'm so glad that I went there.
That's great. Okay, so now we're going to move to audience questions. Marsha, and I have one here. So Sherwood asks, were some of the inherited, this is a really interesting question, were some of the inherited traits that you mentioned, did they also manifest in your siblings?
Oh, my siblings. I don't know if they're watching right now, but yeah, I think so. I do. We had very different experiences growing up. So my sisters are 10 and 17 years older than I am. My oldest sister was actually born as a displaced person in Germany. So, she would have been with my parents when the trauma was more fresh. She too would have, emigrated to a country that she was very young, but she had all of those experiences with them. And then my middle sister was born in Toronto as well. I think, my middle sister's probably anxious like I am. They're both extremely curious. They're both huge readers, just like my father was. Um, and we're quirky in different ways, I would say, but we share a lot in terms of interest in this area of history and in our family. In fact, they know much more than I do. They were like my main source of information for this book. And we all laugh so much. I don't laugh more with anyone than I do with my sisters. So I like to think that we all inherited that way of laughing at really horrible circumstances.
Yeah, that
That's a
accounts.
great question. I hope my sisters are still speaking to me after I answer that.
It accounts for the humor that is just so natural in the book. Um,
Thank you.
and there's a question here about the significance of the title. I think that's a really good question. What's the significance of the book's title?
I absolutely hate to say this, but I don't want to give it away. I want you to read the book because it comes up, and I feel like if I explained it now, it just would not have the same power. But it's, oh God, I don't even know what I can say. It has something to do with my history.
Okay, okay, well,
Sorry.
that's
I know
fine.
that's such a bad, like
That's a
bad,
good tease.
please,
We'll,
please buy the book answer.
Lynn asks, how, when, and where did your parents meet? Can you answer that?
Yes, I can. So, my mother was liberated on April 1st, 1945. It was Easter Sunday and Passover in a town called Kaunitz, Germany. She had been on a death march with about 700 other women who had been marching there from a satellite camp of Buchenwald. And they were on their way to Bergen-Belsen, and they were liberated by the US Army. Word of several hundred Jewish women, some from Poland, reached about 60 kilometers away in Holsten, Germany, where my father was living on this farm, pretending to be a Catholic Pole. He had revealed himself to the farmer and his family as actually a Jewish person. And he wanted to go down there to see if maybe he could find his sister, Devora, who was a Jewish woman. Unfortunately, Devora was murdered at Treblinka, but instead, my father met my mother, and they got married in Kaunitz and had their daughter, Rachel, my oldest sister, there. And that was a place I was planning to visit in 2020, March of 2020, but I didn't get there.
And here's a really good question from Lindsay. What questions has your son asked you about your book? Are there any tough questions to answer for him?
Oh, I'm really struggling with that. He's 13. Do I encourage him to read the book? Of course. I've said to him, you can read it. I handed it to him. I think he's nervous about it. A huge thing that I struggle with is I felt like the Holocaust did a lot of damage to me as a child because of the way it was brought into my life and introduced to me. And I don't want to do that to him. I don't want to damage him by scaring the hell out of him by, this happened to your family. And then by extension, what happened to me was, oh, if it happened to them because they were Jewish and I'm Jewish, could it happen to me? I don't want him to have to struggle with that. He hasn't actually asked me very much, believe it or not, but I think I think he will as he gets older, just like I didn't ask my parents very much when I was 13. I hope that he picks up the book on his own and then he'll have me around to ask any follow-up questions that he has. But that's a great question.
Yeah. I'll ask just one more. How far do you think from Margaret the inherited trauma from the Holocaust will reach? She says that she sees it in her children in their 20s, the grandchildren of a survivor. What do you think this might mean?
That's my huge fear, that my son has inherited this too. Heaven forbid. It seems impossible that he wouldn't, because what happened to my parents has shaped me, and I have shaped him as his mother. And I'm trying really hard to be, normal, if there is such a thing, not crazy, but sometimes I'm a little crazy. And unfortunately, I think he has witnessed that, and I've probably inflicted some of that on him. But I hope that with healing and thought and effort that we can transcend that.
It sounds like you're in a really good place, and he's really lucky to have somebody who can share this story with him so openly, and when that happens. So thank you, Marsha, for your answers and for the book. I really appreciate it.
Oh, Ruth, thank you so much for your questions. They were so thoughtful, and for reading it so closely. I appreciate that very much.
I hate to interrupt this, and Ruth, you and I can see how many questions have come in from the audience. I think Marsha, people are just so interested and just touched by this story and by your story. And I know since you left Ryerson as a with your clinging to that a few years ago, you have been telling stories, and I just want to thank you so much for telling this story and for sharing it with all of us today. We really feel honored that you have joined us, and that we are getting to hear from you about your memoir. Thank you also, Ruth, for joining us today and for sharing your own background and your own wisdom and exploring this topic with Marsha. I think it has been a wonderful half hour, a great book talk, and I really really appreciate both of you joining us. I do want to let the audience know that you'll get an email from us soon with the link to this recording, and you'll be able to share that with your own friends, as I said, and stay tuned for other similar events. And next week is publication date, and you'll be able to pre-order your book now, Marsha's book now, but have it in your hands by next week. So again, thank you both for joining us, and thank you all for joining us today.
Thanks, everyone.